On a Saturday morning in the spring of 2024, on 650 acres of farmland outside Gallatin, Tennessee, a man named John Gregory led 23 children across a creek and asked them to count the cows on the far hill without pointing. He did this every week, not once a month, not when the weather was good. Every Saturday from March through November, a line of children filed out of minivans on Dobbins Pike, pulled on rubber boots that were never quite the right size, and followed John Gregory into the fields. They waded the creek, they touched the soil, they stood inside the corn rows and looked up. They held eggs still warm from the coop. The neighbors on Dobbins Pike watched. They had watched for years. Every Saturday morning, the same procession, parents parking along the fence line, kids disappearing into the pasture, John walking ahead with his hands in his pockets and his voice low enough that you had to lean in to hear him. 300 children a year. From Nashville, 45 minutes south. From suburbs where the closest thing to a farm was a parking lot with a pumpkin display in October. 300 children standing in a cattle field being asked to count cows without pointing, and nobody outside the farm understood why. John did not explain when neighbors asked. He said something about Caitlin's program, something about the kids, and changed the subject. When the county paper called once, he let Caitlin do the talking. He was not a man who explained things before they were ready to be understood. His father, Frosty, said even less. Frosty had been turning people away from this land for 15 years, developers mostly. He would open the door, listen, and close it, 10 times in 15 years. The same answer delivered the same way. Nobody on Dobbins Pike understood what the children had to do with any of it. That summer they found out, if stories of family land, generational roots, and the kind of quiet courage that outlasts everything mean something to you. Subscribe and join us each week. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read everyone. And you'd be surprised how far these stories travel. The land came to the family the way land came to people in 1787, not through money, but through service. A veteran of the American Revolution. A man who had fought for independence before the Constitution was written, received a land grant of 648 acres in Sumner County, Tennessee. He cleared the timber himself. He built the first structure with wood from the property. He planted the first rows in soil, so red it stained your boots for days after rain. That was 9 generations ago. The farm passed from father to son, from son to grandson, through a civil war that split Tennessee down the middle, through droughts that turned the creek to dust, through decades when the price of corn dropped low enough to make a man question everything except the ground beneath him. 9 generations held. Not because they were wealthy, because they did not leave. John Gregory was the 8th. He grew up on Dobbins Pike the way his father grew up, and his grandfather before that, waking before light. Feeding cattle in the dark, walking the rows before school. He was not the loudest of the Gregory men. He was the one who noticed things. He noticed when the creek ran a shade lower in July than it had the year before. He noticed when the soybeans on the west side came up 3 days later than the east. He kept no journal. He carried the farm the way his father carried it, in his feet, in his hands. In the pattern of mornings repeated so many times they became a kind of breathing. His father, Robert, was called Frosty by everyone in Sumner County, not because he was cold, because nothing moved him. Frosty had worked this land for more than 40 years, and in that time he had watched Gallatin change from a town with 1 stoplight to a suburb of Nashville growing faster than anyone could plan for. New developments climbed the hills east of town. 1,000 new houses were approved in a single year. The fields that used to stretch unbroken from Dobbins Pike to the horizon now ended at cul-de-sacs and construction fences. Frosty said little about it. He fed the cattle. He checked the corn. He fixed the fence where it leaned. Caitlin, John's wife, was the one who built the farm school. She was not from a farming family. She married into one and decided that what the Gregory land could grow beyond corn and soybeans and beef was understanding. She designed the program herself. Outdoor classrooms with no walls. Creek crossings where children learned to read water depth by watching how it moved over stones. A trail that wound past the cattle pens, the soybean fields. The old fence line where the posts had been replaced so many times the holes were worn smooth. At the far end of that trail, where the property met the eastern tree line, there was a grave. A simple marker inside a low iron fence, grass growing close around it, the grave of a man who had been enslaved on this land and who died here as a free man. Caitlin made sure every group of children stood at that grave and understood what it meant that this soil held more than crops. 5 children grew up in the middle of all of it. John and Caitlin's kids ran the same paths the farm school children walked, climbed the same fences, waded the same creek. They did not know any other life. They were the 9th generation, and they did not yet understand what that meant. But that spring, something arrived on Dobbins Pike that would teach them. There was an afternoon, John must have been 17 or 18, when he and Frosty walked the eastern fence line together. They did that sometimes, not to fix anything, just to walk. When they reached the grave at the tree line, Frosty stopped. He stood there for a while, looking at the marker, the way you look at something you've seen 1,000 times but still haven't finished understanding. Then he said it. That man died free on this land if I sell. He dies again. He did not repeat it. He did not explain what he meant. He turned and walked back toward the barn, and John followed, and neither of them said anything for the rest of the evening. That was how Frosty taught. Once, quietly, without repetition. Caitlin brought a different kind of knowledge, not inherited, but built. When she started the farm school, people asked why. A working cattle operation has no room for children running through the pasture. Insurance alone would keep most farmers from trying, but Caitlin had figured something out, and she said it plainly one evening at the kitchen table, the way she said most things that mattered. If children don't touch a farm before they're 12, they'll never fight to save one when they're 40. That was not philosophy. That was arithmetic. 300 children a year. 300 families who drove out to Dobbins Pike, parked along the fence, watched their kids wade a creek and hold a warm egg and stand next to a grave. 300 families who knew this farm existed not as an address on a tax record, but as a place where their children had learned something they could not learn anywhere else. Caitlin never called it a strategy. She called it education, but the result was the same. Every Saturday, the Gregory farm added another family to a list that no one was keeping but everyone would remember. The neighbors did not see it that way. "John, you've got 650 acres to run and you're giving farm tours to city kids," one said over the fence one afternoon, not unkindly. "That's time you're not spending on the herd." Another, an older man who had sold his own land to a developer 5 years earlier, shook his head. "Nobody stops progress, John. Nashville's coming whether you teach those kids or not. Your daddy knows that." A third, passing on the road, slowed his truck and leaned out the window. Frosty turned down 10 offers in 15 years, but Frosty's getting older. What happens when the math changes? They were not wrong. Nashville was coming. The math was changing. Gallatin had approved more than 1,000 new homes in a single planning cycle. Tax assessments on agricultural land were climbing. Keeping 650 acres as a farm instead of selling for what developers would pay was a decision that cost more every year. John listened. He nodded the way his father nodded. And he went back to the creek to meet the next group of children. In the spring of 2024, John opened the mailbox and found a letter from the Tennessee Valley Authority. It was not long. It was not personal. It informed him, in the flat language of federal planning, that TVA intended to construct a high-voltage transmission corridor across a portion of his property, a strip 100 feet wide, running east to west, to supply power for the new residential developments expanding north of Gallatin. More than 1,000 new homes needed electricity. The cheapest and fastest route ran through the Gregory farm. John read it at the kitchen table. Caitlin read it after him. Neither said much. The letter did not ask permission, it informed. In Tava held a public forum. One forum, Frosty drove there. John drove there. They sat in folding chairs in a municipal building and listened to a presentation about transmission infrastructure and regional power demand when the questions came. Frosty stood up. He did not raise his voice. He asked one thing: who makes the final decision? The answer came back the way answers come back from large organizations when they do not want to answer. The decision makers are further up the chain. Frosty called, John emailed. They asked for a meeting with someone who had authority. No one responded, not in June, not in July. Not through the fall or the winter. They went silent, and when a large institution goes silent, it is not an oversight. It is a method. The corn came up that spring. The soybeans followed. The cattle calved. Caitlin ran the farm school through the summer and into the fall. 300 children waded the creek and counted cows and stood at the grave. Life on Dobbins Pike continued as if the letter had never arrived. But John kept it in the kitchen drawer, and some evenings after the kids were in bed, he and Caitlin sat at the table and said nothing, and the drawer stayed closed and the silence said enough. Then came August 2025. A truck pulled onto Dobbins Pike and parked near the eastern fence. A man stepped out, unfolded a map across the hood, and began marking coordinates, a surveyor. On Gregory land, without notice, without a phone call, without permission. John walked out. He asked one question. "Do I need to give you permission for this?" The surveyor made a call. The answer came back. Under Teve's authority, they had the right to survey. John stood at the fence and watched a stranger measure his family's land with instruments that did not know what they were measuring. Then came the phone call. A Teva engineer called to discuss the route. During the conversation, he asked about the farm school, but he was not asking to understand it. He was asking to dismiss it. He insinuated carefully, in the way that people with authority insinuate, that the educational program was not real, that it was a cover, something invented to complicate the project. Caitlin did not raise her voice. She sent an email that evening with links to the website, the enrollment forms, photographs of 300 children standing in the fields, video of classes at the creek crossing, documentation stacked like bricks. John called Teva the following day. He asked one question. "Are you willing to remove even a single pole from the plan?" The answer was no, not even one. The neighbors heard. Word travels on roads like Dobbins Pike the way it always has, through truck windows and fence line conversations. John Teva's been running lines since 1933. Nobody's ever stopped them. That's 90 years of precedent. They need the power for 1,000 new homes. That's not a fight you win with a petition. Your grandfather didn't fight the government. He farmed. Maybe that's what you should do. They were right about the history. TVA had laid tens of thousands of miles of transmission lines across the southeast. Farmers objected. Farmers lost. That was the record, 90 years of it. But one evening, after the surveyor's truck was gone, and the map was folded and the fence line was quiet again, John walked to the eastern tree line. He stood at the grave. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Frosty's words were already there, planted years ago in the same soil. He walked back to the house and picked up his phone. Across Tennessee and the states that bordered it, the damage was already done. In Rhea County, a cattle operation that had run for 3 generations was split down the middle by a transmission corridor. The cows grazed on one side, the barn sat on the other. Between them, steel poles and high-voltage lines humming 60 feet above the pasture. The farmer still owned the land beneath the wires. He just could not use it, could not build on it, could not plant anything taller than grass, could not let his grandchildren play under it. Ownership on paper, an easement in practice. In Loudoun County, a family that had grown tobacco and then cattle and then hay watched a survey crew mark their north field the same way the Gregory farm had been marked, without warning. Without asking, without apology, they hired a lawyer. The lawyer told them what every lawyer told every farmer who called about Teve: you can negotiate compensation. You cannot stop the line. They took the money. They did not have a choice, or rather, they had a choice the way a man standing in front of a train has a choice. Across the region, the pattern held. TVA identified a route. Teva notified landowners. Landowners objected. Teva acknowledged the objection. Teva built the line 90 years, thousands of miles. Not one farmer had reversed a route, and in Sumner County, the clock was running. The map on the surveyor's truck had shown it clearly, a red line, straight and clean, cutting east to west through the Gregory property, 100 feet wide. 8 acres of farm consumed. The corridor would cross the creek where 300 children waded every spring. It would pass over the trail that led to the outdoor classroom. It would run within sight of the grave at the eastern tree line. John knew the numbers. He knew the precedent. He knew that Teve had federal authority, federal funding, and a 90-year record of never losing to a farmer with a fence and a phone. But he also knew something Via did not. 300 families had walked this land. 300 families had watched their children cross that creek, hold those eggs, stand at that grave. 300 families did not know about the letter in the kitchen drawer or the map on the truck hood. But they knew the farm. They knew it the way you know a place where your child learned something that changed them, not from a photograph, but from the dirt under their fingernails when they came home. Caitlin had not built an army. She had built something quieter than an army and harder to ignore. She had built a memory, 300 of them in 300 families who had reason to care about 650 acres they did not own. John sat at the kitchen table that evening. Caitlin sat across from him. The drawer with the letter was between them. He picked up his phone and started making calls. John and Caitlin did not hire a firm. They did not write a press release. They did what they knew how to do. They told the truth, plainly, the way you tell a neighbor something over the fence. Caitlin filmed the farm, not with a production crew, with her phone. She walked the creek where the children waited. She filmed the outdoor classroom with no walls. She stood at the grave and held the camera steady and did not say anything because the marker said enough. John spoke on camera the way he spoke everywhere, quietly, without rushing, looking straight ahead. The voice of a man telling you something he believed you needed to hear. The video went online. It was not polished. The lighting was whatever the sky gave them that afternoon. But it was true, and on the internet, true travels differently than produced. A petition went up. Signatures came in from Gallatin, from Nashville, from counties John had never visited. Parents who had brought their children to the farm school shared it. Then their friends shared it. Then strangers shared it. The video passed from hand to hand, the way useful things pass through farming communities, not because someone promoted it, but because people recognized something worth protecting. Then John Rich saw it. The country music star shared the story to an audience of hundreds of thousands. In a single evening he tagged federal officials. He called it what he believed it was. And overnight, a family farm on Dobbins Pike became something FI had not planned for visible. In February of 2026, FI paused the project. The board issued a statement acknowledging concerns and committing to strengthening collaboration and transparency with landowners. In March, TVA abandoned the route across Gregory Farm, chose a different path, established a landowner task force, a new mechanism requiring consultation with property owners before routes are finalized. The power company that had told farmers to accept the lines was now asking farmers where the lines should go. The engineer who had called the farm school a fabrication did not call back, did not email, did not send a letter. The silence from that office was complete, not the silence of someone who forgot, but of someone who remembered exactly what he had said and understood. Too late that 300 children were the answer. A reporter asked John how he felt. He paused the way his father would have paused. Then he said 5 words: "We just wanted to be heard." The map that had been unfolded on the truck hood, the one with the clean red line cutting east to west through the creek and the classroom and the grave, had been redrawn. The line went somewhere else now. The creek still ran where it always had. The trail still wound past the cattle and the soybeans and the old fence posts worn smooth by 9 generations of hands. The grave at the tree line was undisturbed. After the Gregory case, TVA did not simply change one route, they changed the process. The landowner task force became policy. Farmers consulted before lines are drawn, not after. No announcement, no ceremony. The change arrived, the way practical changes always arrive among institutions that have been corrected quietly, through procedure, without admitting what made it necessary. Other farm families in Tennessee began calling each other, not to organize, just to talk, to share what John and Caitlin had done, and to ask whether it applied to them. The conversations spread the way all useful things spread on working land, person to person, fence line to fence line, without anyone declaring a movement. Nobody needed to. The movement had already happened. It just needed a name, and the name was a 650-acre farm on Dobbins Pike, where a man had said 5 words into a camera and meant every one of them. The farm school reopened that fall. Caitlin registered the first group of the new year. 26 children from a suburb south of Nashville climbed out of minivans, pulled on rubber boots, and followed John Gregory across the creek. They touched the soil. They counted cows on the far hill without pointing. They walked the trail past the soybeans and the cattle pens and the old fence posts, all the way to the eastern tree line, where they stood at a simple grave inside a low iron fence and learned what it meant that a man had died free on this land. Wendell Berry once wrote, "The earth is what we all have in common." John Gregory would probably say it simpler than that. He would say, "The earth is what you walk every morning, and what you pass to your children, and what you do not let someone draw a line through, not because you own it, but because it was here before you and it matters more than you." Some things cannot be measured in transmission efficiency or housing units per acre. Some things can only be measured in generations and in the number of children who remember what the dirt felt like under their hands. They drew a line through his farm. He drew a line in the dirt. What stayed with you from John's story? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and tell us where you're watching from tonight. You might be surprised who else is listening. If stories like this one matter to you, subscribe. We'll be back next week with another.